Realism presents itself as a pretty hard-headed approach to politics, and the name realism even implies that, and realism even contrasts itself favorably with what it calls idealism. And so some might argue that the title of this presentation, Realist Ethics, is a contradiction in terms. But I'm going to make the case that it's not quite so. Realism does have ethics, but it's a notion of ethics that's focused on the dangers of an anarchic world. So if we think of realism as an explanatory theory, right, a theory that tries to scientifically explain what goes on in the world, there's not much room for ethics, right? Realists argue that state interests determine what states do, not ethics. And I provided this quote here from Lord Palmerston, a somewhat famous one, about this idea that it's interests that drive things, not any notion of who our friends are. Okay, so in realist theory, interests drive behavior. Moreover, realists argue that there is no universal definition of good, right? For realism, and this is an absolutely central point, realism does have a sense of what's good, but it's the good of the individual state in question. So there's lots of goods, right? Russia has its interests, China has its interests, the US has its interests, and so on. There's only what's good for a particular state. And realists are going to argue that when we hear politicians or analysts or anybody making universal ethical claims, right, they're going to argue that usually that's a disguise for trying to get others to do what's in your interest. So, for example, when the United States says the whole world should be democratic, the cynics are going to say, the realists are going to say, well, that's because the Americans think that democracy somehow is going to augment their power as opposed to others, and so on. And so a key concept in realist theory then is this idea of national interest, right? You're all very familiar with the term national interest. We use it so much we barely even think about it. But the word national in that phrase is really what's key to realists. There are only national interests, not international ones, and it's national interests that should shape the behavior of state leaders. And so that, in the realist view, is the ethical duty of the leader of a state. And so when you hear people use this phrase, America first, which is a phrase with a very sort of checkered past historically, what they're trying to get at, I think, is this idea that the ethical duties of American leaders are only to the United States and not to the greater good of the world. Right? As opposed to this idea that's been around since the founding of the Republic, that the United States was meant to play a force of good in the whole world. However, and following this, this idea of realist national interests, realists do have a notion of ethical and unethical behavior. And what's unethical for realists is to take policies that might cause damage to your state, right? Security is scarce, they say, and so states are always going to pursue their interests. Or in other words, they say, realism captures how the world works. And if we base our policies on the hope for something else, we're not only being foolish, but we're being irresponsible. There is nothing ethical about doing something out of hope that turns out badly for people in the real world. And the classic example of this is the policy of appeasement that England applied vis-a-vis Germany in the run-up to World War II. So we see here the famous picture on the left is Neville Chamberlain, the Prime Minister of England, and of course on the right is Adolf Hitler, the head of Germany, and they were in 1938. And I think you know the story, but essentially Hitler was demanding that Germany be able to take over a part of Czechoslovakia, or what is today the Czech Republic. And the British, instead of confronting Hitler and saying, no, you can't do that, the British said, we don't want to go to war over this, right? It was a very admirable sentiment. We don't want to refight World War I. Instead, we're going to let Germany conquer one of its neighbors. And Chamberlain famously said, we have preserved peace in our time. Well, we know what the rest of the story was. It wasn't just that Czechoslovakia got dismembered, but of course Hitler then became stronger and became encouraged, and the ultimate result, of course, was the slaughter of millions of innocent people. And that is the key realist insight, is that if you try to do something out of optimism or hope, but instead it leads to innocent people being killed, that is unethical, right? Ignoring reality is itself unethical. So it's a kind of hard-headed notion of ethics, but that's what it is. And there is then this ethical position. So to come to a contemporary example, there are those who identify themselves as realists who say, should the United States care what happens to Ukraine? And some of them say, no. We don't want to go to war with Russia. We don't want to have a problem with Russia. So basically, if Russia wants to take over Ukraine or wants to invade part of Ukraine, that's no skin off our teeth. We really shouldn't care. Now, to be fair, there is another equally realist perspective that says, yes, we do want to push back against that, because if we don't deal with Russia and Ukraine, we might be dealing with them someplace that we really do care about. But nonetheless, there is this notion of realism that says simply the fact that Ukraine is an independent country and that we have this idea that you shouldn't invade independent countries, they would say that's not enough to give the United States an interest in protecting Ukraine. That's a great question to debate. Right? So that really gets us to the question I want to end with here. Which parts of realist ethics are you most comfortable with? Which parts of realist ethics are you least comfortable with?